Ahoy, mateys! Welcome to Podcasts of the Caribbean, a podcast covering the world of Pirates of the Caribbean, from the theme parks to the movies and everything in between. My name is Justin Helmer, and I will be your host on this voyage through the Caribbean. It'd be too late to alter course now, mateys. Welcome back to Podcasts of the Caribbean. This is a very exciting podcast. This is episode 4, and in this episode today, we are finishing The Curse of the Black Pearl, which is the first movie in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. If you haven't listened to the last 3 episodes, go make sure you listen to those ones first so you know what's going on in the movie so far. We left off in the 3rd episode right after Jack and Elizabeth were rescued off of Rum Runner Isle, and now we are setting a course back to Ile de Muerta to save Will Turner, who has been captured by Barbossa and his crew and is about to be sacrificed for the blood ritual to break the Aztec curse. So we go over to the Black Pearl, where Will and the crew of the Interceptor are in the brig, and Pintel and Ragetti are mopping the floor. So Will takes this opportunity to ask Pintel and Ragetti about his father. So he asks, you knew Bill Turner? And Pintel says, oh, Bootstrap Bill, we knew him. And then they begin to tell him what happened to Bootstrap after the mutiny with Jack Sparrow. So this is what Pintel says. Never sat well with Bootstrap while we did the Jack Sparrow, with the mutiny and all. He said it wasn't right with the code. That's why he sent off a piece of the treasure to you, as it were. He said we deserve to be cursed, and remain cursed. But of course, that didn't sit too well with the captain. And then he tells Will what Barbossa did to Bootstrap. And he says, he strapped a cannon to Bootstraps. And the last we saw of old Bill Turner, he was sinking to the crushing black oblivion of Davy Jones' locker. And then Pintel has this funny moment where he says, but of course it was only after that we learned we needed his blood to lift the curse. And then Ragetti says, and that's what you call ironic. And then they have a laugh, and then they see Barbossa down in the brig, and he says, bring him. And he throws him some shackles. And then we go right back over to the Dauntless, where Norrington, Murtaugh and Mulroy, Jack Sparrow, and the rest of the Navy are in the boats waiting outside the caves. So Norrington is preparing his plan. He's waiting for the pirates to come out, so then they can take them all out right then and there. But Jack has a different plan, and the way he gets his plan into motion is reminding Norrington about Elizabeth on the Dauntless. So once he does that, Norrington then gives a signal back to the Dauntless, and Gillette locks Elizabeth in the captain's cabin for her safety. And after this, Jack then goes into the caves alone. He rows in. And then we have this fun moment of Murtaugh and Mulroy where Murtaugh's like, what we doing here? And then Mulroy says, the pirates come out unprepared and unawares. We catch them in the crossfire and send them down to sea on top. And then Murtaugh's like, I know why we're here. I mean, why aren't we doing what Mr. Sparrow said we should be doing, with the cannons and all? And then Norrington says, because it was Mr. Sparrow who said it. And that silences Murtaugh and Mulroy. And then Murtaugh says, you think he wasn't telling the truth? Which is a callback to the beginning of the movie where Murtaugh and Mulroy meet Jack for the first time. So Jack comes into the caves here, and then he walks past all the pirates. Barbossa is getting ready to, end the curse with Will's blood. They're all gathered around the chest, and Barbossa is beginning the ritual, and Will's medallion is around his neck, and Barbossa is ready with the knife in hand. And then there's this funny moment of all the pirates cheering for the blood ritual to happen, and then as Jack walks past them, they all start silencing, and then it goes from a super loud chant all the way down to like 1 or 2 pirates, and then Barbossa notices Jack. And then Barbossa's like, it's not possible. And then Jack says, not probable. So, of course, Will sees Jack, and the first thought that comes to Will's mind is, where's Elizabeth? And then Jack says, she's safe, just like I promised. She's all set to marry Norrington, just like she promised, and you're all set to die for her, just like you promised. So we're all men of our word, really, except for Elizabeth, who is in fact a woman. And then Barbossa says, shut up, you're next. And then, of course, Barbossa doesn't care about Jack, and he's about to cut Will's neck. And then Jack says, you don't want to be doing that, mate. And then Barbossa says, oh, I really think I do. And then Jack says, your funeral. So, of course, this is Jack getting, his Barbossa's attention. So, of course, Barbossa rolls his eyes, and he says, why do I not want to be doing it? And then Jack says, because the HMS Dauntless, pride of the Royal Navy, is floating just offshore, waiting for you. So then Jack takes this moment to tell Barbossa his master plan. So he says, you order your men out to the Dauntless, they do what they do best, and there you are with 2 ships, the makings of your very own fleet, mate. Of course, you'll take the Grandis as your flagship, nose to argue, but what of the Pearl? Name me captain. I'll sail under your colors, I'll give me 10% of me plunder, and you get to introduce yourself as Commodore Barbossa. And then Barbossa says, I suppose in exchange you want me not to kill the whelp. And Jack says, no, by all means, kill the whelp. Just not yet. Wait to lift the curse until the opportune moment. And then when Jack says the words opportune moment, he looks at Will, and Will looks very skeptical because he's not sure what Jack's talking about. And then Jack says, for instance, after you kill Norrington's men. And he grabs a few Aztec coins in the chest, and then he says, every, drops one, last, drops another one, and drops one more, and then Will sees Jack pawn the last coin in his palm. So Jack has now been cursed because he's holding on to one of the Aztec medallions. He's taking it out of the chest. So Will notices this, and he realizes that this is a part of Jack's plan to take out Barbossa. So Will goes along with it, and he says, you've been planning this from the beginning, haven't you? Ever since you learned my name. And then Jack says, yep. And then Barbossa says, I want 50% of your plunder. And then Jack says 15. Barbossa says 45. And then Jack says 25. And Barbossa agrees with 25. I mean, he went down from 50 to 25 in the span of 2 seconds. So Jack apparently is also a master bargainer. But then Jack says, I'll throw in a hat. A real big one, Commodore. So maybe it was the hat the hat was what enticed Barbossa over. But Barbossa agrees. And then Jack says, all hands to the boats. And then he realizes he's not the captain. And he says, apologies. You give the orders. Then Barbossa steps up and says, gents, take a walk. And then Jack is confused and he says, not to the boats. And then we have this great scene, iconic scene, if I may say, of the underwater march. So this is, of course, I mean, it was in the trailers and everything, of the pirates walking underwater and then the turning into the skeletons. So we have this great music going on as they're marching through here. And while they're under the boat, of course, the moon is out, so they will be skeletons. But while they're under the boat, they're still human. So we get to see all of these pirates walking below the surface of the water under the Dauntless. And once they come out of the shadow of the Dauntless, they all turn into skeletons. So it's really, really awesome moment. Love that scene. And then we go right over to the Dauntless again. But before we go over to the Dauntless, I should say, while all the pirates were going to the water, Bosun stops Pintel and Rigetti and has another plan for both of them. So as we go over to the Dauntless, Gillette and his men, they see a boat with 2 women rowing out into the water. So they're a little confused. And then we go over and we see that's Pintel and Rigetti dressed up as women. So these are the dresses that they stole from Port Royal earlier in the movie. They're wearing them, and now they are rowing out and causing a distraction. Of course, while they're doing this and distracting the Navy, the skeleton pirates are now climbing onto the Dauntless. And they take out the Navy soldiers one by one, silently and quickly. And they slowly move up and up to the top deck. And while they're getting onto the ship, Governor Swan goes over to the door of the captain's cabin and talks to Elizabeth, who currently is trying to escape the captain's cabin. So Governor Swan at this point, he understands that Elizabeth only accepted Norrington's marriage proposal to save Will. And he has this chat with her, which is a really good scene. And he doesn't hear her say anything, so he says, "Elizabeth, are you even listening to me?" And he opens the door, and she's gone. She has fled the Dauntless, and she's rowing over to the Black Pearl. So Governor Swan goes into the cabin, and he says, "Oh, what have you done?" And as they're doing this, Pintel and Ragetti are still distracting the Navy, and Pintel has this great moment where it's like, "It's just what the Greeks done at Troy, except they were in a horse instead of dresses." And then Ragetti does a cat call kind of thing over to the Navy, and then Pintel's like, "Stop that, or you'll really feel like a fool." And then Ragetti says, "You look nice, though." And then Pintel gets so angry. He's like, "I look nice," and he starts choking Ragetti. And then, with the umbrellas now down, they turn into skeletons. And the Navy sees that. Pintel grabs out his pistol, shoots Gillette's hat off, and the skeleton pirates that were waiting below all run up onto the deck, and now the battle on the Dauntless between the Navy and the pirates has begun. So as that fight begins, we go back over to the cave, where Barbossa, a few of his pirates, and Jack and Will are currently waiting. They're waiting for, of course, the pirates to come back with the Dauntless as their prize. So Barbossa's sitting there, and he says, "I must admit, Jack, I thought I had you figured, but it turns out you're a hard man to predict." And then Jack says, "Me, I'm dishonest. A dishonest man you can always trust to be dishonest, honestly. It's the honest ones you want to watch out for, because you can never predict when they're about to do something incredibly stupid." And he walks over to one of Barbossa's crew. He grabs the sword out of their belt. He knocks that pirate into the water. He throws the sword to Will. Will frees himself. Barbossa notices. He grabs his sword. He stands up, and the fight in the caves begins. So now we have two fights going on at once. And Jack and Barbossa are fighting. Will is fighting the pirates in the cave. The Navy is fighting the pirates on the Dauntless. We have fights going on all over the place. So Jack and Barbossa are fighting. Jack cuts off the feather off Barbossa's hat. While they are at crossed blades, Barbossa says, "You're off the edge of the map, mate. Here there be monsters." And then we go over to the Black Pearl, where Elizabeth is boarding the ship. And there's two pirates still currently on the Black Pearl. So she goes up on deck, and then she gets surprised by Jack the Monkey, who is still also cursed. But this time, he isn't scaring her. So she grabs Jack the Monkey and throws him off the ship, and he lands on the cannon right in front of the pirates. And then they see it, and then they go and run up on deck. And while they run up on deck, Elizabeth hides and runs below deck to the brig to free Gibbs and the rest of the crew. So we then go back to the Dauntless, where the fight is raging, and one of the Navy soldiers starts ringing the bell and gets Norrington's attention. Norrington then looks over and sees the battle happening, and he says, "Make for the ship! Move!" So all of Norrington's men, who are waiting for the pirates outside of the caves, now make their way as quick as possible back to the Dauntless, because the pirates are on the Dauntless. So Pintel and Ragetti make their way over to the Dauntless, and they climb in through the gun ports, and they and the rest of the pirate crew start readying the guns, and they start firing on Norrington and his men, who are still rowing over in the boats. So while Norrington's under attack, Governor Swan has locked himself in the captain's cabin. He's seeing all the horror going on outside, and then one of the dead Navy soldiers' face slams into the glass of the door, and then Kohler, who killed that soldier, looks in and sees Governor Swan inside the captain's cabin. So then we have this great scene of all the skeleton hands breaking in through the glass of the captain's cabin, and one of the skeleton hands grabs Governor Swan's wig off his head. So then Governor Swan's trying to grab it back, so they're stuck in this like tug of war, and then Governor Swan grabs a stick and he breaks the skeleton's arm off and gets his wig back. So then we go right back over to the caves where Jack and Barbossa are still locked in a heated duel. And they're going up this incline on the side of the cave. And Barbossa drops his sword and he says, "You can't beat me, Jack." And then Jack takes this opportunity and stabs Barbossa. And then Barbossa sighs, and then he pulls the sword out and stabs Jack Sparrow. So this is a big, crazy moment, and Will notices this. And Barbossa smiles. He thinks that he's finally killed Jack Sparrow. But Jack steps back into the moonlight. And then Barbossa notices that Jack is cursed, because Jack took that piece of Aztec gold a little earlier. So Will sees Jack is now cursed, and then Jack pulls out the coin and spins it through his fingers and says, "Couldn't resist, mate." And then Barbossa gets angry, and then they start fighting once again. And then Will begins to fight the pirates. So the pirates he's fighting are, most notably, it's just Jacoby. The other two pirates he's fighting, the one's name is Monk, and the other one, I am not too sure. I would have to look it up. The other pirate is one of the ones that isn't important at all in the plot, but he is fighting Jacoby, and then the one with kind of the sock cap is named Monk. So now that Jack is also cursed, neither of them can die. So Jack and Barbossa are now locked in a heated duel. And then we go right back over to the Dauntless, where Governor Swan has a skeleton problem. So the skeleton arm that he smacked off one of the pirates is now on the ground, moving around, and Governor Swan starts smacking it with the stick that he has, and then he picks up the arm, thinking it's dead, and then it comes back to life and tries to claw at him, and then he shoves it in a drawer and slams it shut, and then the arm is still kind of trying to get out, and he's trying to hold it shut to the best of his ability, and he's scared to death. So then we go back over to the cave, and then Will is fighting two of the pirates. So he's fighting them, and then he has the one pirate stab Jacoby, and then Jacoby lets out a yelp. Jacoby tries to get at Will again, and then he stabs the other pirate. So now they're both stabbing each other, and Will looks at them, and then they both grab their swords out, and they start to run after Will as he runs away. And then we go back to Jack and Barbossa, who are still fighting, and then Barbossa has this great line, and he says, "So what now, Jack Sparrow? We to be two immortals locked in an epic battle until Judgment Day and trumpet sound?" And then Jack says, "Or you could surrender." And then we have this great Barbossa moment where he hits Jack in the face, and then as Jack runs away, Barbossa just screams at him. That's a fantastic moment. And then we go back over to the Black Pearl. So we have a lot of switching between scenes here. We go back over to the Black Pearl, where the two pirates are on deck looking for whoever was up there, and then they turn around and one of the rowboats slams them right off the ship. So off they go, and Elizabeth has now freed the crew, and she says, "All of you with me. Will is in that cave and we must save him. Ready? And heave." And then none of them help her. So Elizabeth's like, "Please, I need your help, come on." And then Cotton's parrot says, "Any point in the storm," which is some random line, but of course Gibbs is like, "Cotton's right." Cotton's right, we've got the pearl. And then Elizabeth says, "So what about Jack? You're just going to leave him?" And then Marty says, "Jack owes us a ship." And then Gibbs says, "And then there's the code to consider." And then she says, "The code." "But you're pirates. Hang the code and hang the rules. They're more like guidelines anyway. So then Elizabeth, not getting any help, she just begins to row over to Ile de Muerta by herself. And as she does that, she says, "Bloody pirates." And Gibbs and the rest of the crew have now stolen the Black Pearl. So we go back over to the Dauntless, where Pintel and Ragetti notice the Pearl is sailing away. And then Pintel says, "They're stealing our ship." And then Ragetti says, "Bloody pirates!" And at this point, Norrington and his men have reached the Dauntless, and they're climbing up the side. And Norrington jumps on board. He shoots his pistol at Kohler, and then we have this great duel of Kohler and Norrington while the rest of the men fight the other pirates. So we have this cool difference in style here as they fight. So Kohler, of course, has some really just rugged, kind of bloodthirsty slices as he fights. And then Norrington has these kind of very refined, classical sword fighting parries and blocks. So we see that difference of kind of sword fighting between the pirates and between the Navy, with, Norrington, who has been trained in sword fighting, and a pirate here who, of course, has just learned through experience to kind of just take as much blood as you can instead of really trying to do a kind of a classical sword fight, which is kind of how Will fought in the beginning. But as Will also progresses through this movie and also the next two movies, we see Will kind of get a more kind of piratey fighting style as well, where of course he's still the most skilled swordsman in the franchise, but he kind of implements some more pirate moves into his arsenal. So as, he evolves, his sword fighting also evolves. So Murtagh and Mulroy, they come up, and then they're scared to death. They see all these pirates clashing with the Navy on deck, and they shake hands, and then they let out a scream as they rush on deck. And then we go right over to the caves again, where Jacoby throws a bomb and blows up a pile of treasure and leaves Will on the ground. So while Will's on the ground here, Jacoby comes up and says, "I'm going to teach you the meaning of pain." And before he's about to strike Will, Elizabeth says, "You like pain?" And then boom, she knocks Jacoby to the ground with her giant pole or spear, whatever this is, and she says, "Try wearing a corset." So of course, Elizabeth is now here. We have all of our main characters in the same place. And now it's time for Will and Elizabeth to get down to business. So Will and Elizabeth see Jack and Barbossa fighting, and then Elizabeth says, "Whose side is Jack on?" And then Will says, "At the moment." And then Elizabeth runs over and just starts attacking the pirates. So this is where we kind of really get to see Elizabeth in her element as she's fighting these pirates, which kind of really paves the way for how her story goes. So this is really awesome to see Elizabeth really getting into the action here. And then we have Will and Elizabeth just taking down these pirates, showing them up. Like, the teamwork here. Like, I know a lot of people like Jack and Elizabeth together and all the other ships, but like, you cannot tell me that Will and Elizabeth aren't the best couple. Like, the way they just do things together, and they don't even have to say anything, and they take these three pirates down so easily. They stab them all on that spear, and then Will puts a bomb in Jacoby's chest, and they push him back into the darkness, which makes him human again. So of course at this point, Jacoby can't get the bomb out of his chest, and he says, "No fair," and then boom, the bomb goes off. Those three pirates are dead, or I don't really know. I guess they exploded, but they're still alive because they're cursed. But yeah, they're obviously not alive anymore, though, because Elizabeth and Will just destroyed them. Anyway, now we're getting down to the end here. We'll go right back over the Dauntless for one more moment. Ragetti loses his eye here, and he's trying to chase it through all the craziness that's happening on deck. And Bosun is chasing down Gillette, because Gillette's trying to take down Bosun. He misses his shot, and then everything's dire circumstances on the Dauntless. But then we go right back over to the caves, and Jack and Barbossa are getting to the end of their fight here. Will and Elizabeth run over to the chest. Will grabs his medallion off his neck. He gets the blood. Jack cuts his hand, gets the blood on his medallion, throws it up to Will. Will now has both of the coins in his hand, and then Barbossa pulls out his pistol and aims at Elizabeth, and then, boom, the gun goes off. And we're meant to think here that Elizabeth got shot. But then we go over and we see it was Jack's pistol that fired, not Barbossa's. So Barbossa says, 10 years you carry that pistol and now you waste your shot. And then Will says he didn't waste it. And they all look up at Will, who opens his hand and drops both of the bloodied coins down into the chest. So of course, now that the blood was on both medallions, the curse was broken. So Barbossa notices this, and then he pulls his shirt down and sees the blood coming out of the gunshot wound. And then Barbossa has his last words here. He looks up at Jack, and Jack lowers his pistol, and Barbossa says, "I feel cold." And then he falls back onto the treasure, and he drops the apple that he had in his hand. And Barbossa is now dead, and the curse is broken. So we go over to the Dauntless, and all the pirates are back to human form. And because of this, Darrington had just stabbed Kohler, so Kohler also is dead. So all the pirates here know that they are now at a disadvantage. So Twig is the first one to drop his weapons because his friend Kohler is now dead. So Twig drops his weapons first, and the rest of the crew follows. And as they all drop their weapons, Rigetti finally grabs his eye and puts it back in, but they are cornered by Murtagh and Mulroy. And then Pintel says, "Parley?" And then Norrington says, "The ship is ours, gentlemen." And they all say, "Huzzah! Huzzah!" And they're all celebrating. Governor Swan comes out of the captain's cabin, and he is all happy and everything, and he does this little moment where he fake punches the pirates and everything. And I should mention, right before he comes out, he looks in the drawer and is just disgusted. So I'm guessing there's just a human arm in that drawer, which honestly is disgusting. I mean, and that also begs the question that one of the pirates on the deck went back to his curse and just has one arm now. That's so, honestly, you don't think about those things, but one of those pirates on that deck now only has one arm because he lost his arm and he can't put it back on because he's no longer cursed. So, unfortunately, that pirate only has one arm, but that's what hooks are for. But then we go over to the caves again, and Will and Elizabeth have a nice little scene here together where they look at each other, they smile, and they look back at Jack, who was going through all the treasure, and Jack's taking his spoils. And then Elizabeth says, "We should return to the Dauntless." And Will says, "Your fiancé won't be knowing you're safe." And then Elizabeth runs away in this moment, and Will has lost his chance. Jack comes up to him and says, "If you were waiting for the opportune moment, that was it." And then Will, of course, is feeling bad about himself because he wasted his chance at Elizabeth. And Jack says, "Now, I'd be much obliged if you dropped me off at my ship." And they go outside of the caves, and they see the pearl is gone. So Elizabeth apologizes to Jack, and Jack says they've done what's right by them. Can't expect more than that. So we then go over to the next morning, which is Jack's hanging. So Jack is at the gallows here, and he's ready to be hanged. Even though he did help them kill Barbossa and save Elizabeth and save Will, he's still a pirate, so he's getting the fate that pirates got in these times, which was hanging, or it could be worse. But Jack is up there, and the person who is listing all of Jack's crimes, I love that, and Jack just starts laughing and smiling at some of them. But I just love how he just goes on and on and on and on and on. Like, Jack has committed so many crimes, and then when he gets to, like, the funny ones, Jack says, "Oh yeah," and starts laughing. And he looks over at the executioner, and then he just, like, stops laughing. Funny, funny moment. And then Murtaugh and Mulroy are there, and the bird that is on their, like, flagstaff thing, which also happens to be a very familiar blue and yellow parrot, poops on them. Poops on Mulroy's shoulder. So, and then we go over to Elizabeth, Governor Swan, and Norrington, who are standing in the shade, and Elizabeth says, "This is wrong." And Governor Swan says, "Commodore Norrington is bound by the law, as are we all." And in this moment, Will appears in a very dashing outfit. He's got kind of like the Three Musketeers hat and the red cape and the dual belts and swords. So I don't know what look he was going for here. I guess he was trying to look like a pirate. But he comes up and greets all three of them. And then he says, "Elizabeth, I should have told you every day from the moment I met you. I love you." And then apparently Norrington and Governor Swan are shocked because they look over at Elizabeth, and Elizabeth just knows. And as Will walks away, Governor Swan kind of just sighs. And then the drummers start to do the drum roll. And then we have this moment where Jack looks over at Elizabeth. And then Elizabeth then begins to distract Norrington and her father. So I'm guessing that they talked about this as they were going back to the Dauntless. They talked about Jack's escape here. Because Elizabeth is a part of the plan. Not just Will. Elizabeth is also part of the plan, which is pretty interesting. They don't kind of talk about how they planned that. So Elizabeth does her famous "I can't breathe," and she fake passes out and falls down, which distracts her father and Norrington. And while they're distracted, Will comes up and he screams, "Move!" And then the executioner pulls the lever, and right as Jack begins to fall, Will throws one of his swords and slams it right into the board, right under Jack's feet. Jack's now balancing on this sword so he doesn't die, because if he falls off the sword, his neck will be broken and he will die. So Will runs up to the top, and then he's fighting off the executioner, and then he pushes the executioner off, and at this point Norrington has noticed, and Governor Swan is like, "Oh, I should have known." And then Norrington and the Marines, they come up, and Will pushes the executioner off the platform, and he falls on Norrington and his men. And then it's this moment where Jack frees himself. He comes down, cuts off his binds with the sword, and then Will does an awesome backflip off the platform, and they both run up, they grab the rope, and they run over, they trip all the guards, and they do this awesome teamwork move where they're both escaping together. And they do all these cool moves. They get behind the column there, and then as the soldiers come up, they punch and they elbow and they do a roll, and then they are then, of course, trapped by a bunch more Marines who all have their bayonets drawn at them. So Norrington comes up and says, "I thought we would have to endure some manner of ill-conceived escape attempt, but not from you." And then Governor Swan and Elizabeth also make their way over, and Governor Swan says, "On our return to Port Royal, I granted you clemency. And this is how you thank me? By throwing in your lot with him? He's a pirate." And then Will says, "And a good man," and he drops his sword. And then we have this funny moment of Jack, he just points to himself. And then we have one of my favorite Will Turner quotes, and one of my favorite quotes in these movies. And Will says, "If all I've achieved here is the hangman will earn 2 pairs of boots instead of 1, so be it. At least my conscience will be clear." And then Norrington says, "You forget your place, Turner." And then Will says, "It's right here." between you and Jack. And then Elizabeth takes this moment and she walks over to Will and she says, as is mine. And at this point, Governor Swan tells all the soldiers to lower their weapons. And Norrington is feeling heartbroken in this moment. And he says, so this is where your heart truly lies then? And she says, it is. And Jack sees the familiar parrot from earlier fly away, and then he takes this as his next escape attempt. So he says, well, I'm feeling rather good about this. I think we've all arrived at a very special place, eh? Spiritually, ecumenically, grammatically. And then he, Governor Swan in that moment just, his breath must stink. And then Jack walks over to Norrington and says, I was rooting for you, mate. Know that. Then he begins to walk away and he says, Elizabeth, it would have never worked out between us, darling. And then Elizabeth's super confused, and then Jack says, I'm sorry. And then he says, Will, nice hat. And then Will smiles as Jack begins to walk toward the edge. And then he says, this is the day that you'll remember as the day that you almost caught. And then he falls off, just like Elizabeth did earlier in the movie. And everyone goes over to the side and sees him fall into the water. And Gillette says, idiot, he's nowhere to go but back to the noose. And then one of the soldiers spots something in the distance, and then we go over and we see the Black Pearl is back to save Jack Sparrow. So Jack begins to swim over to the Pearl, and then Gillette says, what's your plan of action, sir? And then Norrington, in this moment, doesn't really know what to do. Governor Swan, though, says, it appears on the rare occasion the right course demands an act of piracy. Piracy itself can be the right course. And then Norrington thinks about this, and then he says, Mr. Turner. And then he goes over to Will, and he pulls out his sword that Will made earlier in the movie, and he says, this is a beautiful sword. I expect the man who made it to show the same care and devotion in every aspect of his life. And then Will says, thank you. And as Norrington walks away, this isn't in the movie, but it's a deleted scene, where right before Norrington walks away, he has this moment where he turns back to Elizabeth, and he says, oh, and Miss Swan, a very best of luck to you both. And he smiles as he begins to walk away. And I'm so sad they cut that out, because yet another part of Norrington's character that's not in the movie. Why are they taking out all these great Norrington scenes? I don't know. But as Norrington begins to walk away, Gillette says, what are we going to do? And then Norrington says, well, I think we can afford to give him 1 day's head start. So Norrington and the Navy, they all walk away, leaving just Will and Elizabeth and Governor Swan. So Governor Swan says, so this is the path you've chosen, is it? After all, he is a blacksmith. And then Elizabeth says, no. He's a pirate, which of course gives us the title of our theme song and the moment where Elizabeth and Will finally kiss for the first time. Everyone cheered. Everyone cheered in this moment. This is one of my favorite moments. I just love when they kiss and the music starts pumping and the shot zooms out. This is one of those moments that really brings me back to watching this movie as a kid. Every time I see this moment, I just think about that, and it brings me back and makes me so emotional. This is one of those moments in these movies that really just gives me a heavy hit of nostalgia, because I have such fond memories of watching these movies so many times. But we have that fantastic moment of Will and Elizabeth kissing for the first time. I love them. Oh, I love them so much. And then we go over to Jack, who is getting back on the Black Pearl. The crew throws him a rope in the water, and they pull him on deck, and he flies over the mast, and then falls right on the deck. And then Gibbs and the rest of the crew come up, and Jack says, I thought you were supposed to keep to the code. And then Gibbs says, we figured they were more actual guidelines. So then they give him his hat back and everything, and then Anna Maria, who's on the wheel, says, Captain Sparrow, She walks over to him and puts his coat on his back, and she says, "The black pearl is yours." So it's finally that moment where Jack has the pearl back, finally, after all these years. So we have this fantastic moment of him slowly walking over to the wheel, and then he just puts his hand on the wheel and just glides it across as the crew smiles at him. And then Jack looks around and he gives some orders to his crew, and the crew begins to run over to their places on the ship. And then Jack's on the wheel, and he has one last line, and he says, "Now, bring me that horizon." And we'll stop there real quick, because I have a very, very cool story about this specific line. So this, of course, is one of Jack Sparrow's most famous lines in these movies. And there is a really great story behind how they came up with this line. So I've got my book here. This book that I'm getting this from is actually called Bring Me That Horizon, which is The Making of Pirates of the Caribbean, written by Michael Singer. You can get this book still on Amazon or eBay or whatever. It's a very good book that details the behind the scenes and the making of the first 3 movies. And in this book, we have this great story from Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio about Johnny giving them this line. So I'm not sure if I'll read it word for word, but I have it here. So let's just read it here. So this is Terry Rossio who is telling the story here. So he says he goes and hooks up with Ted on the Lady Washington, which of course is the real ship that played the Interceptor. And they're thinking of these phrases for Jack's final line. So they still hadn't found what line they were going to use. So they were talking, and they were having all these different lines like "put the wind to our aft" or "to stations, let's go and haul to run free," and all these things. So they take these lines to Gore Verbinski, who's the director of the film, and then he is like, they're okay, but they're not what they should be. It's not. It can be better. It can be better. So they're still on the Washington, and then they get a message over the walkie-talkie that Johnny Depp wants to meet them in his makeup trailer. So as they're over there, they're still on the ship, and then they hear a shout, and they look over, and then they see Johnny Depp running over to them, half done in makeup, half in costume, with a piece of paper in his hand as he's running over. So he's shouting, he's shouting, "I've got it, I've got it, I've got it!" And he races full speed toward the gangplank of the Lady Washington. And then, so Terry says in this, he says, "Let me tell you something about gangplanks. They're not very sturdy. Whenever we went across, the production was careful to have a sailor on either end to help you on and the other to help you down on the ship. But Johnny wasn't waiting for that. He bounded onto the gangplank, it bounced him into the air, and light as a feather he came down on it, bounced up again, and landed gracefully on deck." So he comes up to Ted and Terry, breathing heavily, and he says, "I've got it," and he shows them the paper. And then they look at the paper, and on this paper, there's actually an image of it in this book here. So on this paper, it says, "Darling, the black pearl has always been mine. Right then, look alive, mates. Bring me that horizon." That's exactly what it says on the note that Johnny gave Ted and Terry. So they read it, and Ted says, "That's pretty good." And then, they go over and take it to Gore, and then Gore says, "That's pretty good. That's really good." So now he has the line finally. So that was the story of how they got the "Bring Me That Horizon" line, which of course has become so famous. And then we have a final part of this little note here, where Terry, who has written this whole little note about this phrase and how it came to be, Terry says, "As of this writing, I don't know if the movie is good, or if the lines made it in, or even if they worked the way they should. But if the film is good, it's fun to think that the final line of the film was written the day it was shot. I hope it does work. I hope the movie is great. Because I've got something pinned above my desk. The scrap of paper Depp was waving as he ran out of the trailer that he wrote the line on. I kept it, of course. It has our favorite line on the movie, one that we didn't even write." So I love that so much. It's fantastic. The date of this note, of course, is April 30th, 2003. This was the day they were shooting this scene. But I love this so much, and I'll probably I'll scan this page and post it on Twitter and Instagram so everyone else can read it, because it's fantastic, and it has the note on here as well. But it's just I just love the idea in my head of Johnny Depp running over as fast as possible, screaming, I've got it," with the note in his hand with the "Bring Me That Horizon" line on it. And it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite behind the scenes stories. So of course I wanted to make sure I shared it on this podcast here. So Jack, of course, says the line, "Bring me that horizon," and then he starts to sing yo ho, a pirate's life for me. So it's the final time we get it in this movie. And then he opens his compass, and then he says, "Drink up, me hearties, yo ho," and he closes his compass, and the film cuts to black, and then the credits begin to roll. And that is the end of Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl. It has taken us 4 episodes to get through this one movie, but man, hope you've enjoyed this journey so far. Before we finish this up, we'll go over to the post-credit scene of this movie, which is back in Ile de Muerta. So Barbossa's corpse is still lying there, and Jack the Monkey goes up to the chest of the Aztec gold, and he grabs one out. And then we have this moment where he's still in there, and he looks at the camera, and then we see that Jack the Monkey is once again cursed. And then he screams at the camera, and then it cuts to black one more time, and that's the end of the movie. So that's the fun little post-credit scene, which does come back in Dead Man's Chest. So we'll talk about that when we begin Dead Man's Chest. But yeah, that's Curse of the Black Pearl. That's it. So very, very happy we've gotten through the first movie. Still have 4 movies to do, and we still have all these other things that we can cover on this podcast. So yeah, another almost hour-long episode, but that ends The Curse of the Black Pearl. So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I hope you've enjoyed these 4 episodes on the first movie. We'll be getting into the second movie, Dead Man's Chest, very soon. So I hope you're excited for that. But that'll do it for this episode. So I'll see you next time for the beginning of Pirates of the Caribbean, The Dead Man's Chest. Podcast of the Caribbean is in no way affiliated with Disney. If you want to send me an email or a question, you can send it over to podcastofthecaribbean@gmail.com. You can also follow this podcast on Twitter at podcastpotc, and you can also follow us on Instagram at Podcast of the Caribbean. So I'll be posting some content, some other fun facts and everything on those platforms. So make sure you give them a follow so you don't miss any content and any updates regarding the podcast. So as always, be sure to keep a weather eye on the horizon, and always remember, dead men tell no tales.